Greetings everyone. Welcome to the ongoing series on Women in Indian History 1500 to 1950. Today we are going to discuss the topic Women and Education in Colonial India. In this, at the very onset, I would like to introduce you to the concept of colonial modernity. The idea of modernity went along with the processes of colonialism and became integral to the idea of the nation state. Modernity unfolds a narrative of progress, a break from an irrational tradition, and a derived meaning in which we always overcome and surpass that which came before. Modernity is implemented through science, technology, the development of new social institutions, for example, schools, colleges, universities, factories, hospitals, prisons, etc. And this involves a whole new way of mobilizing people and showing them alternative directions. Now, it is in this background that when one can approach the aspect of gender and colonialism. Gender was central to India's experience of colonialism. From the institution of sati in the 1820s to later conflicts over widow remarriage or the age of consent, the status of Indian women attracted the reforming zeal of not only missionaries but also colonial legislatures as well as metropolitan liberals. So, for Indian conservatives, the reformers and later nationalists, women and the family were potent symbols conveying a variety of different class, community as well as national identities. So, the issue of gender appears to be a very complex issue with multiple identities and multiple narratives. Colonialism posed troubling issues both for men as well as masculinity. Religious reform societies and political leaders of all shades of opinion sought in different ways to create a new moral vision for men and gender within family, community, society and ultimately nation, often in the face of unsettling assertions of women's rights and freedoms. So, the question of masculinity in relation to class, community and property rights assumed great importance throughout the 20th century, and in fact the process started from the late 19th century also, as India's future leaders debated legislation over Hindu as well as Muslim personal laws. The heightened significance of gender was nowhere more striking than over the years of partition, when violence against women on either side underscored their roles as symbols of community, class, state and family honor. Now let us look at what were the motives behind the colonial education. The spread of English education by the British was not out of generosity. There were different motives that were working behind this attempt. So, for example, one can talk about the religious motives, the proselytizing urge, that is to inculcate new values in the spirit of Western liberal Christian concepts. Then another very important motive was the administrative, that is to staff the vast and elaborate bureaucracy which the colonial administrators now needed since they had established their rule over India. Then economic, that is to familiarize Indians with the modalities and values of the capitalist economic system, and also to instill in them a taste for colonial English products, British manufactured items, and lastly, and but not the least, that is the political, because ultimately the whole system was geared and had to gear in such a way to consolidate and maintain colonial dominance in the country of their rule. So therefore, right from the onset, we see that it was with these limited and selfish motives that the idea of so-called modern education was floating. And therefore, one can also outline a number of weaknesses that were visible in colonial education, because no program of mass education was initiated. The only concern was that a small class of English educated Indians should emerge out of the millions and should serve as interpreters as well as supporters of the Raj. Now, this small class would be English in tastes, in opinions, in morals and intellect. So, the knowledge and the values which were taught by the colonial regime were definitely Western in nature and were eventually used to stabilize the Raj. The British started a system of education in India on the basis of the system that existed in their mother country, and most of the emphasis was on the language of English. The knowledge of English became very crucial for people who wanted to occupy official positions as well as leadership roles. So, because of this overall emphasis on the Western ethos, there was largely a neglect of rural areas. Most of the educational institutions were located in urban areas as they were within the reach of the British government as well as British administrative machinery. Rural areas therefore were neglected and little attention was paid to curriculum. With the adoption of English as the medium of instruction, the vast mass of people were progressively estranged from the administrative, judicial as well as commercial institutions that had been established by the British, and it was only a handful of elite, the Bhadralok, who kind of benefited out of this new system. Villagers were not able to understand the modalities of the colonial institutional operations. They were forced to depend upon those who were English educated. So, English bestowed unprecedented prestige on the English educated Brown Sahibs because of their link with the colonial economic and political interests, and therefore largely remained alienated from the masses. There were also a number of limitations of Indian universities. Though they were modelled after the University of London, the Indian universities were not same in terms of quality of education that was imparted in London. Indian education was not meant to give technical or scientific education, and it laid more emphasis on languages and humanities. The excessive emphasis on the mastering of English as a language often overshadowed the purpose of education. So, what appeared was a very mechanical kind of a learning through memorizing and a discouragement to inquisitiveness and an experimental bent of mind, as has been pointed out by Aparna Basu in her research on colonial education. So, what we can say is that there were limited opportunities throughout the colonial period because of this kind of growth of education. The curriculum of English education was in tune with the colonial economic and employment policies. All the higher appointments in almost all the services were reserved for the British. There was lack of any concrete idea for industrialization, which meant again very limited opportunities for qualified and trained Indians, except in the lower hierarchy of the bureaucracy or in teaching professions. So English education also created a huge number of unemployables. Now, a very important aspect that we need to discuss, especially with reference to gender and education, is the issue of separate curriculum. The Western style education was introduced by the British initially for boys, but the girls began to study the same curriculum as boys in the beginning. So educated males demanded different curriculum designed to meet the special needs of the girls, as they argued that the boys were receiving an education to be trained for certain jobs and for their professional growth, which was not the aim of the girls who went to schools. So right from the beginning, there was a different benchmark for boys and girls in attaining education. So by 1882, people were convinced in favor of a differentiated curriculum, and the Education Commission of 1882 declared the same. So the government officials were partly convinced that a curriculum change was desirable and that curriculum should be more suitable to girls' socialization process, the social roles that the girls were going to play in their future life. So therefore, certain subjects that emerged as feminine, for example, hygiene, domestic science, singing, needlework, home science, etc., whereas some subjects came to be categorized as masculine. For example, physics, chemistry, mathematics, etc., came to be earmarked in a different category altogether. Now, advocates of women's education agreed that there was no need to make a different curriculum at the primary level, but at the secondary level, the schooling was viewed more critically and was found that the girls needed to follow a different curriculum so that they could fulfill their roles of a wife or a mother in a better way. At the college level, the girls were allowed to take masculine subjects if they wished to do so. So, one can talk of the Hunter Commission 1882, which kind of validated the differentiation of curriculum and the utility aspect of the subject. Diversification of the curriculum into two parts appeared. One was to prepare the student for further studies, and the other was to give them education that would be useful in their day-to-day life. It recommended immediate arrangement of public funds for more schools for girls, appointment of lady teachers, inspectresses, a separate curriculum also for girls, and special hostels for girls and arrangements for higher education. Now, besides these initiatives that were being taken, we also see that another narrative that was developing during the colonial period was that Indian women were basically white man and woman's burden. So therefore, it was considered as part of the duty of the colonial rulers to kind of civilize Indian men by exposing them to the outside world, by letting them join schooling. So therefore, Indians were not seen as equals but in need of a savior. And in this, they were also kind of overlooking or neglecting the efforts that were being taken from within Indian society to bring about change. British feminists were right from the beginning imbued with an imperialist consciousness of racial superiority as well as hierarchy, and the larger belief that British rule would ultimately improve India and Indians also was very important. So Western feminism, which was largely influenced by imperial assumptions of the mother country, kind of declared colony as the site of reform. In this background, we also need to talk about Victorianism. So the colonial policies towards women were largely based on Victorianism, that is, the perceptions in which females were secluded in the home for a more balanced, peaceful life, and they had largely to be protected from the outside world. So British policy made scriptural writings as the reference material for devising social reforms in India. The nationalists refused to allow British rulers to interfere in the private sphere of family, whose pillar of strength was woman, a point that has time and again been made by scholars like Kumkum Sangari and Sudesh Vaid. So we have a number of females like Mary Carpenter, who was an educational and social reformer, who visited India in 1860s, and her account of 6 months in India basically referred to a very deplorable position of Indian women, and she promoted the cause of female education in colonial India through her writings. The emphasis was more on criticism, however, than on improving conditions for women. British feminists robbed Indian women of their agency by portraying themselves as the prime movers of the progressive thinking concerning Indian society. Then another writing by Catherine Mayo, Mother India, was published in 1927, and it projected Indian culture as highly exploitative towards women. So Catherine Mayo argued that it was the moral responsibility of the colonial rulers to protect minority groups, especially women, and that without imperial rule, Indian women would remain vulnerable and exploited. However, when all this was being said and done, the colonial masters completely neglected the reality of contemporary Western society. Because even if we talk about the Western world in those times, married women had hardly any legal rights and no female franchise. They had no property rights. Husbands exercised legal power over their wives and could imprison or beat them. Divorce and child custody laws also favored men, giving no rights to women even in the Western world at that time. Most occupations were closed to women, and there was no concept of equal pay. Women were not allowed to enter several professions like medicine or law in Western countries. Women were debarred from higher education since no college or university accepted female students, and on the whole, the situation was quite deplorable. But all this was neglected, and colonial modernity was projected as a gendered issue in a colony like India. Now, there was also a process of reconstitution of domestic space under colonialism. So there was great deal of opposition, and the binaries of the outside world and the inner world became more and more clearer and glaring. So the pre-existing caste, class, familial and gender demarcations were largely reworked during the colonial period, and between the 1820s and 1850s, the colonial state willingly accepted a liberal Brahmanical interpretation of religious scriptures. Indian men, to counter the idea of British supremacy, invented new modes of patriarchal power. And this was done by discovering an ancient golden past as well as by mapping the identities and nation. We can also discuss the limited vision of reform movements when we are talking about gender issues during the colonial period. So, colonial conservatism also appeared time and again, and the whole idea and concept of colonial modernity can be questioned, because the colonial state was quite reluctant to provide assistance to women who converted to Christianity and asked for state support in fighting social injustice. For example, in 1872, a young girl, Huchi, converted and refused cohabitation with her husband. However, the courts and the missionaries did not support this stand, and they forced her to go back to her husband, even though she was treated as an outcast by her family. Then one can give some other examples also. For example, Nair men, having got educated and employed during the colonial period, started opposing the matrilineal system of inheritance, which was largely prevalent among the Nair community. They started objecting to the system because they could not pass on their self-earned wealth to their offsprings. So, the Malabar Marriage Act of 1896 made some changes in matrilineality, and a new law came into force in 1933, which allowed Nair men to pass on their incomes to their offspring and also allowed them to set up conjugal households. So therefore, such changes were coming on as a result of initiatives that were being taken by the colonial lawmakers. Now, if we come to the next aspect, and that is reformism and gender, we can say that the social reform movements also had a contradictory relationship with the gender question. And by the end of 19th century, women agency came on its own, and associations of Indian women carried forward the initiative of reform in the realm of female education, health and franchise. The agenda of religious and social reform was largely rooted in liberal reformism. The reforms were proposed within an environment of female seclusion, and celibate widowhood continued to remain a very important ideal. Also, for child marriage, a scriptural and social necessity due to detrimental effects of educating girls was the overall discourse which was usually discussed time and again. Another very important ideal was that of purity. So, reformism and women's education had to operate within the limits that had been set by orthodoxy. For example, even when reformers like Ram Mohan Roy were trying to stop sati, he had to guarantee that widows would follow ultimately the path of purity even without committing sati. And this had to be followed, this ideal had to be carried forward at all cost. So therefore, what we come across is the process of schooling amidst orthodoxy. In Bengal, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar set up the first schools for girls in Calcutta, and social ostracization happened because literacy was supposed to lead to widowhood. Then we have a number of examples of women like Raj Sundari Devi, an upper caste rural housewife who secretly taught herself the alphabets while doing her domestic work, and she ultimately authored the first autobiography in the Bengali language. Then Ramabai Ranade wrote about the conflict within the homes as the liberal husbands forced their wives to become literate, and educated women developed a questioning mind and became critical of their domesticity. And here we have example of Tarabai Shinde and also Pandita Ramabai in Western India, then Kailash Bhasini Devi in Bengal, who critiqued upper caste households, and educated women were mocked at in folk art and were projected as masculine or as home breakers and as biologically inadequate in bearing and rearing kids. So their reformist friends and husbands were also mocked at as feminized or weak, as well as lacking in masculinity. So therefore, we see that the overall picture does not appear to be as simplistic as it has been projected. There were several shades of grey that also need to be highlighted as one is talking about colonial modernity. Thank you.